Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Markson. Here's what's coming up on the program. Treasury has appointed a new head of the Productivity Commission, but will Chris Barrett have what it takes to turn our economy around? Also tonight, is Bruce Lerman eyeing off a career in politics? And will the Liberal Party support him? Our exclusive report coming up tonight later in the show. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is trying to avoid an AUKUS revolt from the Labor left, but is he sabotaging our diplomatic relations with Israel in the process? Michael Shoebridge will join me later. But first, to one of the biggest cover-ups by scientists and government officials of our time. An astonishing deception that warrants apologies and retractions. Tonight, the damning evidence that proves that the very scientists and leading government officials who told us COVID-19 came from a wet market actually suspected it was genetically engineered in a Wuhan lab. A cache of emails and Slack messages has been subpoenaed by a United States congressional committee. The US Select Subcommittee on the Origins of COVID-19 subpoenaed emails and Slack messages from the scientists who wrote a paper published in the prestigious journal Nature Medicine that said the virus had a natural origin. They insisted a laboratory leak was a conspiracy. The private correspondence shows how the group of international scientists, including from Australia, colluded to insist COVID-19 had a natural origin. Spurred on by Anthony Fauci, they would insist any likelihood of human error for this outbreak was a conspiracy theory. But that's not what they said privately. This is the most extraordinary revelation. Have a look at what these leading scientists, who would go on to call the lab leak a conspiracy, who would go on to tell governments, policymakers, journalists, and intelligence agencies that COVID came from a wet market. Well, this is what those scientists said in private. Evolutionary biologist, University of Sydney's Edward Holmes said, and I quote, "Ian Lipkin just called, very worried about the furin cleavage site, and says that high-ups are as well, including in intelligence." He said, let's face it, unless there's a whistleblower from the Wuhan Institute of Virology who is going to defect and live in the West under a new identity, we are never going to know what happened in that lab. Never. Christian Anderson, another one of the authors of the Proximal Origins paper, said, "I think the main thing still in my mind is that the lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario." He said, "I hate when politics is injected into science, but it's impossible not to, especially given the circumstances." In this private Slack conversation dated February the 1st, they also discuss whether to destroy the world, meaning say there's a lab leak, they're speaking metaphorically, based on their analysis. Another scientist, Andrew Rambeau, said, and I quote, "Given the shit show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say, given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we are content with ascribing it to natural processes." In another Slack message, Andrew Rambeau said, "The whole thing is doing my brain in. I literally swivel day by day, thinking it is a lab escape or natural." And if you're just tuning in, I'm reading out private correspondence, private emails and Slack messages that the scientists who went on to say a lab leak was a conspiracy were saying amongst themselves. Another scientist, Robert Gary, said, and I quote, "Transmitting a bat virus like RATG13 and HeLa cells and then asking your graduate student to insert a furin site would get you there." In another message, he said, "It's not crackpot to suggest this could have happened given the gain of function research we know is happening." And Anthony Fauci, who was the coronavirus advisor to both President Trump and then President Biden, and he's been a health advisor to generations of presidents, he said this in an email, and I quote, "They were concerned about the fact that upon viewing the sequences of several isolates of the new coronavirus, there were mutations in the virus that would be most unusual to have evolved naturally in the bats, and that there was a suspicion that this mutation was intentionally inserted. The suspicion was heightened by the fact that scientists in Wuhan University are known to have been working on gain-of-function experiments to determine the molecular mechanisms associated with bat viruses adapting to human infection, and the outbreak which originated in Wuhan." There are hundreds of pages of this stuff. As I say, it is damning. This is what these scientists were saying to each other in private. They've tried to stop many journalists, many organisations getting their hands on this correspondence under Freedom of Information laws, but now subpoenaed and obtained by a United States congressional subcommittee. And just a reminder about what these very scientists were saying in public. Well, they wrote an article published in the prestigious Nature Medicine journal. They called it "The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2." It was published in March 2020. A draft was completed a month earlier. And in it, they insisted a lab leak was a conspiracy. They wrote, "Our analysis clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus." Well, their analysis showed no such thing. When I started investigating the Wuhan Institute of Virology back in April of 2020, one of the scientists, Eddie Holmes, was quoted by Media Watch as saying that this was a conspiracy theory. Christian Anderson, another scientist, he publicly described suggestion the virus was genetically manipulated as a crackpot theory. He said that on the 3rd of February 2020, whereas I've just shown you what he was saying in private. And at the same time as this group was having discussions about whether the virus was in fact genetically engineered. Many of these scientists would go on to advise the intelligence community. And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the United States released a statement we now know is false. That statement in early 2020 said, "The intelligence community also concurs with the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified." Well, there wasn't then and there wasn't now any wide scientific consensus to say that it wasn't genetically engineered. The US intelligence agencies didn't know that then, and they can't know that now. In fact, the world's leading scientists thought that the virus did look genetically modified, as I've shown you, and many world-leading scientists today believe SARS-CoV-2 was or might have been genetically engineered. And you often can't tell if a virus has been genetically modified because it doesn't always leave a trace. The most recent US Intel Community update, by the way, still states that most agencies say SARS-CoV-2 wasn't genetically engineered. And I asked the Office of the Director of National Intelligence when I was researching and writing my book whether they would be correcting their early 2020 statement. They didn't correct it. It's quite frankly unbelievable that they're called the intelligence community because they're not very intelligent. And we've done a better job investigating the origins of the virus and uncovering what was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology than the agencies appear to have done.
And while the Wuhan lab does do such things, the world's top virus experts from the US, UK and Australia, writing in Nature, rule it out in this case.
Our analyses clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus.
One of those experts, Sydney University's Professor Eddie Holmes, who helped map the genome of SARS-CoV-2, went even further last month with a statement to say,
"There is no evidence that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19 in humans, originated in a laboratory in Wuhan, China."
And the CSIRO, where the two Chinese scientists once studied bat viruses, agrees, telling MediaWatch,
research of the genome has found no evidence of laboratory manipulation, and there is no published evidence of this virus having been previously identified.
So, given all those expert doubts, was this sensational treatment really justified?
Batman! Exclusive!
We think not. We also think Markson should have told readers that almost every virus expert had dismissed the lab escape theory.
And that was, as you can see, Paul Barry quoting one of the scientists who was publicly saying a lab leak was a conspiracy, but privately was entertaining and discussing and acknowledging that it was a very real possibility. And that, by the way, was part of a nearly 10-minute diatribe, a takedown of our reporting or any suggestions that an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology was a plausible scenario for starting the pandemic. It was the first of several reports that MediaWatch has done on this issue. The former editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper, Chris Mitchell, wrote in his column today, MediaWatch, the wider ABC and Channel 9 papers have produced one-sided coverage designed to reinforce the idea the virus spread from a wet market in the Chinese city of Wuhan rather than from a laboratory in the nearby Wuhan Institute of Virology. He wrote that ABC management should be asking Paul Barry and his team why it spent so much airtime in the past 3.5 years trying to suppress a story that looks increasingly probable. Chris Mitchell also, in his column today, quotes journalist Matt Taibbi as saying that the emails and the correspondence between the scientists show how health officials and scientists constructed perhaps the most impactful media deception of modern times, exceeding even the weapons of mass destruction fiasco. These revelations are massive. We, as the public, were assured by trusted scientists that the virus came from a wet market. The world trusted the scientists to tell us the truth, not to cover up on behalf of China, not to cover up so that their dangerous research or their pay packets wouldn't be affected, not to cover up the truth. Millions of people have now died, and they are all owed justice, and their families are all owed justice. Covering up for an accident in Wuhan so scientific research wouldn't be affected is unthinkable. Unsurprising, there is now a group of equally world-leading scientists calling for Nature Medicine, part of the Nature group, to retract the Proximal Origins paper.
The emails and Slack message communications between the scientists themselves that they did not fully believe the conclusions of their paper, and they never told the public that.
My full interview with Justin Kinney coming up. The Proximal Origins paper is a farce. It should absolutely be retracted. Combined with the febrile US politics under Trump and the connections and secrets of a community of scientists involved in gain-of-function research, this all led to a complex collision of misinformation, deceit, and dastardly from which the world is yet to fully recover. The manipulation of the truth on this issue has been truly shocking.
Well, I've looked into this, and other journalists have looked into this as well as scientists, and there really is very little evidence. It's on the outer bounds of possibility, but really so unlikely that you could say definitely that it's not the case. It's not from the lab.
And I put questions to Eddie Holmes, and a spokesperson from the University of Sydney sent through a statement saying that Professor Eddie Holmes is an exceptional scientist and a world-leading authority on viral evolution. They say he was the first to publicly release the genome sequence of SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19 in humans, and his continued research collaborations have revolutionised our understanding of the virus for the benefit of humankind. They say he strongly defends the integrity and independence of his research, and the many papers he has co-authored have undergone rigorous peer review prior to publication in line with proper scientific process. And that's their right of response. Now, let's bring in Sky News host and the Daily Telegraph's National Affairs editor, James Morrow. James, thank you for your time. Look, I'm going to get on to the other big stories of the day, but this is so major. I just want to get your reaction to that. These scientists saying one thing in their private discussions and deciding to mislead the world and tell us a lab leak was a conspiracy.
Yep, and absolutely, Sharri. Everything you said there was absolutely spot on. And so many people here in Australia and around the world really ought to be absolutely ashamed of themselves, I think, for the way that they politicized the virus, because it became, you recall, this whole big tribal thing. Trump said, oh, it could have come from a lab. And then suddenly the whole thing had to be, it didn't come from a lab. It came from, this Wuhan wet market idea. Now, of course, and I know, and we were all talking about this early on. There's a lab in Wuhan that was doing this kind of work. So how hard was it to imagine that this happened to have made it out of the lab? So that is part of the problem. And the other problem, and I think you really start to hit the nail on the head there, Sharri, is the ongoing problem here is that this has caused such a massive distrust in institutions, in science, in expert advice. And this is really so damaging because it has made everybody, myself included, and I'm sure a lot of people out there, so cynical about what it is, when we're told, oh, no, this is the thing you need to know, this is the thing you don't need to know. And we see it still, Facebook, all of these different outfits are all trying to censor what people say. And this is really, it's very bad for civil society. It's bad for politics.
I agree. If you can't trust leading scientists, who can you trust? It is so damaging. Now, the Treasurer today appointed a new head of the Productivity Commission, Chris Barrett. He'll serve a term of 5 years. He'll try to rectify our long-term slump in productivity. Jim Chalmers fronted the media today. He said that inflation is moderating, but not easing as quickly as the government would like. Have a quick look.
Today, Cabinet has agreed to recommend to the Governor-General that Chris Barrett be appointed the Chair of the Productivity Commission for a term of 5 years. Chris's appointment recognises that if we want to build a stronger economy, then we've got to build stronger economic institutions, and that means renewing and refocusing and revitalising the Productivity Commission.
James, what do we know about Chris Barrett, and is he up to the job?
Well, the biggest thing we know about him, Sharri, is that he's Wayne Swan's former chief of staff. You remember him, the world's greatest treasurer. Look, the coalition is absolutely blowing up about this because they say that they weren't consulted about this pick, and I think they're right to be blowing up about this. The Labor has never really loved, shall we say, the Productivity Commission. They've always sort of thought that it was this real sort of, free market, neoliberal sort of organization. And in fact, actually, a number of suggestions of the Productivity Commission have been knocked back by Labor because they say, well, it doesn't meet our values. So that, I think, tells you a lot about what you need to know. But the other thing here, Sharri, that's really, really key to this here is that we are not going to get, they're talking about inflation and interest rates. We're not getting out of that without productivity. And Labor right now seems to be running away from productivity. They're running towards shoving more money into the economy. And these are the things that are going to keep us in this position where we're not going to really get the real growth, the genuine growth, the productive growth that we need to see in the future.
Now, very quickly before you go, James, Stan Grant has permanently now stepped away from presenting the Q&A program at the ABC, this after he was taking some time out in May. It came after the ongoing racist abuse that he received. He's not the only one now to have come out, the only Indigenous Australian to have come out to say that they have been targeted by racist abuse in this debate as the debate around The Voice kicks off. We've also heard from Warren Mundine. This is getting, as we've been saying, but every day it just gets worse.
Well, it's been very, very ugly. And, I just think it's, ridiculous for people on the yes side of the debate to say that, oh, their opponents are being terrible when so many of the yes people have been attacking people like Warren Mundine, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, and calling them the worst sort of slurs for having opinions that don't go along with their narrative.
Yeah, all right. James Morrow, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Look, we've got a lot coming up on the show tonight. As I said, our exclusive at the top of the show about Bruce Lohmann's future. Does he have a future in politics? That's coming up later. Plus, we're going to return to our top story, and the scientist Justin Kinney will join me to discuss the role that Anthony Fauci played in the coercion of the science community. That's next.